Sunday, December the 7th, 1941, began like any other day on the island of Negros. Missionary Paul Lindholm was returning from a church conference on Cebu. His wife Clara lay in the mission hospital about to give birth. At Silliman University in Dumaguete, the Wynn family attended morning services, then shared a quiet dinner. No one expected what came at dawn on Monday. By 7 o'clock, radios crackled with stunning news. Japanese warplanes had attacked Pearl Harbor, smashed the Pacific Fleet, and bombed Clark Field north of Manila. The war was no longer a distant rumor. It was here. Within hours, the comfortable world of the American expatriates on Negros collapsed. Paul Lindholm, his wife Clara, now delivered of a baby girl named Janet, rushed his family into the mountains behind Dumaguete. Gardner Wynn, a pacifist missionary, gathered his wife Viola and their three small children and headed for a summer cottage on the slopes of Cuernos de Negros. Sugar engineer George Osorio loaded his wife Loretta and son Kenneth into a company truck and fled to a hideout in the hills near Manapla. They all believed the fighting would be over in a few months. They were wrong. Through the winter of 1942, the Japanese army swept through the Philippines. Bataan Peninsula fell on April the 9th. 78,000 American and Filipino troops surrendered. Among them was Sergeant Howard Crisco, a cook from the Missouri Ozarks. Crisco and his comrades were forced onto the infamous Death March, a 60-mile trek north through searing heat, with no food, no water, and guards who beat or bayoneted any man who faltered. 10,000 men died on that road. Crisco survived only because a Japanese soldier ordered him to drive a truck. The survivors were herded into prison camps, but a few months later the Japanese selected 10 American prisoners, including Crisco, and shipped them to the island of Negros. There they were forced to work as truck drivers for the occupation forces. They drove supplies to Japanese garrisons, repaired military vehicles, and endured constant beatings from their new commander, Colonel Oshiyama. They were prisoners, but they were alive, and they were watching for any chance to escape. On the morning of May the 21st, 1942, a small Japanese invasion force lay off the coast of Negros. By 10:30, landing craft carrying soldiers and 6 American prisoners hit the beach at Bacolod. The occupation of the island had begun. Missionary Gardner Wynn, hiding in the hills above Guihulngan, faced an agonizing choice. Japanese collaborators threatened to shoot his Filipino host, Mateo Malaje, if Wynn did not surrender. To protect the man who had sheltered him, Gardner gave himself up. Gardner Wynn was taken to a prison camp in Bacolod, then to Santo Tomas in Manila. His wife Viola refused to follow. She stayed in the jungle with her 3 children, trusting God and the Filipino people to keep them safe. In the mountains of southern Negros, 2 young officers, Major Salvador Abcid and Major Ernesto Mata, refused to surrender. They led their men into the interior and began organizing a guerrilla resistance. The Americans remaining on the island, missionaries, sugarmen, coconut planters, escaped prisoners, now looked to a distant promise. General MacArthur's pledge, soon to appear on chocolate bar wrappers dropped by submarines, the words, "I shall return," the summer of 1943 brought little relief to the 10 American prisoners held in Bacolod. They worked as truck drivers for the Japanese occupation forces, hauling supplies under the harsh eye of Colonel Oshiyama, a commander who beat them for the slightest infraction. Sergeant Howard Crisco and his fellow prisoners had talked of escape for months, but no plan seemed workable until the afternoon of July the 4th. The guards had scattered for weekend passes, leaving only a single soldier, known to the Americans as Blockhead, to watch the garage. Crisco saw his chance and called 6 fellow prisoners from the Bacolod garage together. Jensen slid behind the wheel. Joseph pulled a Japanese helmet over his head to pose as a guard, and the rest climbed into the bed. The truck lurched backward, sideswiping the doorframe as Blockhead appeared on the balcony above, staring down at them. Crisco waved and smiled, and the guard, seeing nothing unusual, simply folded his arms on the railing and watched them pull away. The 7 men drove past the cathedral, past the public plaza, past the checkpoint at Banago Wharf, and out of Bacolod, free for the first time in 15 months. They never learned what became of Blockhead, but back at the garrison he was beaten within an inch of his life for his carelessness. 3 miles north of town, they abandoned the truck in a rice paddy and began climbing into the mountains. They walked through the night and into the next morning, covering 30 miles before reaching a remote guerrilla outpost. The rebels welcomed them with cooked breakfast and secure shelter, the first real hospitality the Americans had known since before Bataan. The men called themselves the Lucky Seven, and within weeks, they were scattered among different guerrilla units across Negros, some fighting alongside the Filipinos, others assigned to intelligence work behind enemy lines. Crisco joined a company staging ambushes against Japanese convoys, his soldiers' war beginning again in earnest. By early 1944, the tide of war had shifted dramatically across the Pacific. American carrier task forces were punching through the Japanese defensive perimeter, island by island. The great Japanese naval base at Truk had been shattered in February, and Admiral Koga Minichi, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, knew his own headquarters at Palau would be next. On the morning of March the 30th, 9 American carriers launched wave after wave of Hellcats and Helldivers and Avengers against the Palau Islands, destroying 200 Japanese aircraft and 36 ships in 2 days of relentless attack. Koga ordered an evacuation of his staff, planning to fly 600 miles west to Davao, where he could continue to direct the war. On the night of March the 31st, Koga climbed aboard a Kawanishi flying boat and lifted off from Palau Harbor, his chief of staff, Rear Admiral Fukudome Shigeru, following in a second aircraft. Koga's plane vanished into a storm front and was never seen again. Fukudome's pilot battled the same tempest for hours, running low on fuel, and attempted a desperate night landing off the coast of Cebu. The big seaplane hit the water hard, broke apart, and sank. 13 men survived the crash, among them Fukudome, who swam through the flames and floating wreckage with a broken leg. At dawn, local fisherman Ricardo Bolo spotted the survivors in the water, paddled out in his banca, and pulled the Admiral ashore, not knowing he had just captured the second highest ranking officer of the Imperial Japanese Navy. As the Japanese army scoured the coastline for any trace of the missing men, a shopkeeper named Pedro Gantuanco spotted a dark object bobbing in the surf near his village. He sent his neighbor Opoy Wamar to retrieve it. The box was slick with black oil, and when Gantuanco pried it open that night, he found a red leather portfolio embossed with an elaborate emblem, the leather moist and glistening under his kerosene lantern. Inside lay packets of damp papers covered in Japanese characters, a silk sack, a pouch containing small gold nuggets, other secret materials. Gantuanco knew the Japanese were offering a reward of 50,000 pesos for the missing documents, but he also knew what the occupation had done to his people. The fisherman buried the portfolio under dried fronds behind his mother's house, then contacted a local guerrilla, handing over the entire bundle, including the captured war plans of the combined fleet. The survivors of the crash, including Admiral Fukudome, were moved inland by volunteer guards and delivered to the headquarters of Lieutenant Colonel James M. Cushing, commander of the Cebu Area Command. Cushing, a former mining engineer known to his men as Suicide Cushing for his fearlessness in combat, immediately recognized the value of his prisoners. He radioed MacArthur's headquarters in Brisbane, reporting the capture of a Japanese flag officer and requesting instructions. But the Japanese army on Cebu had learned of the capture and began a savage reprisal, burning villages, torturing civilians, bayoneting innocent men, women, and children to force the return of their admiral. Cushing faced an impossible choice. He could hold the prisoners and watch his people die, or he could release his captives and betray the trust of his command. He chose his people. The guerrilla colonel drafted a letter to his Japanese counterpart, Colonel Onishi Seito, offering to return Admiral Fukudome on the single condition that the killing of civilians must stop. Onishi accepted, and on the afternoon of April the 10th, 1944, the prisoners were carried down a dry riverbed and handed back to the Japanese army. Cushing watched through binoculars as the enemy soldiers bowed low before their admiral, then turned away, sick at heart, knowing he might have thrown away the most valuable intelligence prize of the Pacific War. But what the Japanese did not know, what Fukudome had not realized, was that the red leather portfolio had never left guerrilla hands. Cushing had the documents, and when his men found someone who could read the Chinese characters mixed with Japanese script, they understood these were no ordinary field orders. This was the Z Plan, the Imperial Navy's strategy for the decisive battle that would decide the fate of the Pacific. Cushing ordered the papers rolled tight and sealed inside 2 empty artillery shell casings, protecting them from water and enemy eyes. He summoned Sergeant Russell Snell and Private Jim Dyer, 2 of the lucky 7 who had escaped from Bacolod the previous summer, and told them they were going home. On April the 15th, Snell and Dyer crossed Tanyan Strait with the mortar shells strapped to their backs, carrying the combined fleet's most secret plans toward Negros, toward a submarine, toward Australia, and toward the men who would use them to change the course of the war. The mortar shells arrived in southern Negros in mid-April, carried by Russell Snell and Jim Dyer after their harrowing crossing from Cebu. The 2 lucky 7 members had walked for days through guerrilla-held territory, the brass casings never leaving their sight. Absid received the cylinders with the gravity the moment demanded. He knew these papers had come from a crashed Japanese flying boat, knew the enemy had offered a fortune for their return. He ordered the shells opened and the documents dried, then placed them in a sealed container for the next submarine. In Brisbane, Colonel Courtney Whitney at the Philippine Regional Section had been tracking the prisoner drama from Cebu with growing alarm. When the Tokyo radio announced Admiral Koga's death on May the 5th, the pieces finally clicked into place. Whitney realized that Cushing had captured the late commander's battle plans. He rushed a memo to General Sutherland urging an immediate submarine pickup. Any delay, he argued, could cost the Navy its chance to read the enemy's strategy before the next great fleet engagement. The request sped through channels with unusual speed. Across the mountains of Negros, the word had already spread. American civilians who had spent more than 2 years hiding in the hills began moving south. The Lindholm family, the Wynne children with their mother Viola, the Osorios, the Reals, the Fleischers, all packed what little they could carry and started the long trek toward the coast. The coconut planter George Fleischer brought his wife Paz, their 4 children, and a young Silliman student named Modesta Hughes who had been stranded on Negros since the first day of the war. They walked single file through the Kogan grass, guided by guerrilla scouts who watched the ridges for Japanese patrols. The route led them across the Kabadiangan Plateau, a barren stretch of razor-sharp grass that offered no shade and no cover. Mothers carried infants on their hips. The younger children rode ponies or clung to carabao sleds. At night they slept in abandoned huts or under the stars, eating cold rice and dried fish, for Viola Wynne. The trek was the last ordeal of a long nightmare. She had not seen her husband Gardner since he surrendered to the Japanese 2 years before. She kept her children moving by promising them that at the end of the trail, a ship would take them to Australia, to safety, to freedom. On the evening of May the 7th, a radio message crackled through the ether to a submarine patrolling the waters off northern Borneo. The USS Crevalle, a Balau-class fleet submarine on her 3rd war patrol, had already sunk 3 enemy ships. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander Frank Walker, was looking for more targets. The orders from Fremantle terminated his patrol and sent him north, to a remote point on the coast of Negros. His new mission: collect 40 American passengers and a packet of secret documents. Walker was a submariner who wanted to fight, not ferry civilians, but he acknowledged the orders and set a course for the Visayas. Colonel Absid confirmed the rendezvous by radio. The beach at Balatong Point, just north of the tiny barrio of Basay, was secure. The refugees began filtering down from the hills, gathering at a coconut grove a few hundred yards from the surf. By May the 10th, 40 souls were camped among the palms, missionaries and planters, teachers and ex-prisoners of war, a newborn infant and an old woman. They had walked across an island to reach this strip of sand. Behind them lay the Japanese occupation. Ahead, if the submarine came, lay home. The late afternoon sun of May 11th, 1944, cast long shadows across the charred coconut grove at Balatong Point. 40 American refugees huddled among the palm trunks. The Lindholm family was there, along with the children of Viola Wynne and the sprawling Real and Osorio clans. Their eyes fixed on the empty stretch of water beyond the reef. After 2.5 years of hiding, they were waiting for a vessel to rise from the depths and set them free. Lieutenant Commander Frank Walker, crouched on the conning tower deck of the USS Crevalle, pressed his right eye against the cold rubber eyepiece of the periscope and swept the horizon in a slow, crabbing circle. When a surface vessel is searching for a signal, every patch of white on the beach, a burst of foam, a flash of bird plumage, a bleached log can raise the hackles along your neck. Walker spotted the security signal, two white panels laid 50 yards apart on the dark sand. He ordered the boat to periscope depth and snapped the scope down, calling out in a clipped voice for the deck crew to stand by. It was nearing 8:30 in the evening. The Crevalle's deck was slick with salt spray as she broke the surface. Motor machinist's mate John Mayle swung the hatch open, and the smell of the land-rotten coconuts, decaying leaf litter, washed into the conning tower, layering over the sharp tang of diesel fumes that coated the bridge rails. From the beach, a flotilla of outrigger bancas pushed off into the surf, manned by nervous guerrilla lookouts who scanned the dusky sea for any sign of a Japanese patrol. The first banca bumped against the submarine's hull, and the passengers began to climb aboard, solemn, sunken-eyed figures clutching the hands of their children. The Lindholms passed infant Janet carefully from arm to arm. The Wind children, wide-eyed and silent, followed Viola across the wet deck plates. Walker watched the line of passengers descend the forward hatch with a growing sense of unease. He had been told the pickup was for 25 civilians. By count, there were now 40, and the boat was becoming dangerously crowded. He stepped aside and took the leather oilskin bag of documents directly from the guerrilla officer's hand, his fingers recoiling with the sudden weight of dozens and dozens of rice-thin, coded pages. The Z plan. He sealed the bag in a watertight container, gave a sharp nod to Executive Officer William J. Rouet, and gestured for the last of the deck crew to move below. The last bamboo raft carrying a cluster of refugees bumped away from the hull. The hatch clanged shut, and Walker barked an order to clear the bridge. The Crevalle began her emergency dive. A shout from the conning tower watch froze Walker in the hatch. The lookout had spotted a Japanese patrol boat rounding the southern arm of the point, its bow wave a white arrow pointing straight at the now empty stretch of sea where the sub had surfaced. A searchlight snapped on, a white hot blade raking the water where the Crevalle had quietly slipped below the surface. The boat sank fast, the descending planes hissing past the hull as the needle on the depth gauge fell rapidly past 30, then 50 feet. On the bottom, the sea floor gave a thin wall of concealment, and the crew held their breaths. The first depth charge detonated a quarter-mile off the starboard beam, a dull thud that traveled through the water and rattled the Crevalle's hull like a handful of dice in a box. A second charge erupted closer, shaking loose dust from the overhead cables and piping. Below decks, the refugees huddled in the battery well and the forward torpedo room, many of them seasick, their faces green with the strain of the air and the vibrations drumming through their hands. Howard Crisco, the ex-POW from the Bacolod escape, who had joined the last group of refugees at the beach camp, sat with his back against a torpedo tube, eyes closed, listening to the pattern of splashes and explosions outside. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the barrage stopped. The patrol boat's screws faded into the distance. The Crevalle leveled off and began to creep southward into the gathering dark. 2 days into the transit south, the usual routine of life on a submerged submarine had settled into a clammy, airless rhythm. The stale air in the Crevalle's compartments had grown thick with the scent of sweat and stale cooking, and the 40 passengers, mixed with the regular crew, turned every corridor into a jungle of bodies. There was no place to lie down, no water to wash, and no way to see the sky. Paul Lindholm and his family were packed into the forward torpedo room, the children crawling over the cold steel tubes to find some space among the sleeping sailors. The Z-plan sat in its waterproof container, lashed to a stanchion in the captain's tiny stateroom under Walker's personal eye. On the second night out, while transiting the Makassar Strait, a monstrous typhoon swept across the vessel's path from the west. The sea, which had been placid and warm, began to pitch and roll the submarine in long, groaning walls of water that heaved the boat beyond its designed roll limits. Walker ordered the Crevalle to dive to 120 feet. That should put them below the storm's fury, but the swells still flexed through the water column, slamming the ballast tanks and shoving the boat from side to side with each passing wave. The passengers, many already sick, retched into buckets. The cook who tried to bring a tray of hot coffee past the torpedo room was hurled across the aisle, the tray clattering onto the deck plates. Walker gripped the periscope handle and held on, waiting for the fury to pass. He refused to break radio silence, unwilling to risk even a whisper of transmission that might betray his position to the Japanese pickets that studded the strait. The storm began to ease on the morning of May 19th, the seas settling from a mountainous, chaotic chop into a long, steady swell. Below decks, the first sunlight in days streamed through the periscope lens onto the face of the sailors standing watch. In the forward battery well, Viola Wynne held her children close and looked up at the metal overhead, not knowing what the future held, but knowing she was no longer on the run. The Crevalle was still 1,000 miles from the safety of Australia's west coast, but the worst was behind them. The Z-plan was safe, the refugees were safe, the war in the Pacific would now have a new chapter, and the outcome had just tilted a few degrees toward the Americans. Down in the wardroom, Frank Walker sat in his chair, turned a page in his logbook, and allowed himself a single, tight-lipped smile. On the 8th of June, the USS Crevalle slid alongside the submarine pier at Fremantle, Western Australia. The hatch swung open, and 40 refugees squinted into the bright Australian sunlight, men, women, and children who had spent more than 2 years hiding in the jungles of Negros, among them Howard Crisco, still bearing the scar from the bullet that nearly cost him his arm in the Murcia ambush, stepped onto solid ground for the first time as a free man. Lieutenant Commander Frank Walker personally carried the oilskin-wrapped Z-plan documents to the intelligence officers waiting on the dock. Within hours, the dried and wrinkled pages of Combined Fleet Secret Operation Order No. 73 were spread across a table in a secure room, being translated and analyzed by Allied codebreakers. 11 days later, on the morning of June 19th, the Japanese First Mobile Fleet steamed into the Philippine Sea, committed to the decisive battle that Admiral Koga had planned before his death. But the Americans already knew the strategy. Forewarned by the captured Z-plan, Admiral Raymond Spruance had positioned Task Force 58 exactly where the enemy carriers would have to come. The result was not a decisive battle, it was a slaughter. American Hellcats and Avengers destroyed more than 300 Japanese aircraft in a single day, an engagement that would forever be remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Imperial Navy's ability to wage carrier warfare was effectively ended in those 2 days over the open ocean, and the Z-plan, that salt-stained leather portfolio recovered by a fisherman off Cebu, had helped make it possible. When the war ended in August of 1945, the survivors scattered to rebuild their lives. Gardner Wynne was liberated from Santo Tomas prison camp in Manila and reunited with Viola in Australia. The separation that had begun when he voluntarily surrendered to protect a Filipino family was finally over. The Lindholms returned to the United States, where Paul continued his missionary work, and Howard Crisco, after medical treatment for his wounded arm, received a promotion and a new start. The fishermen Bolo and Gantuanco returned to their villages, fading into memory. Fukudomi was repatriated and lived quietly in Japan. Snell, Dyer, and Modesta Hughes, who had crossed the Pacific as refugees, returned to civilian life in America. On Cebu, James Cushing was formally recognized by the United States Army for his intelligence contributions and survived the war to return to civilian life. Salvador Abcid, who had refused to surrender in 1942 and built a guerrilla army from nothing, was later decorated for his leadership of the Negros resistance. The rescue of those 40 Americans was more than a successful evacuation. It was a thread that connected a fisherman's discovery off a Cebu beach, a guerrilla colonel's impossible choice, and a submarine captain's steady hand all the way to the deck of an American carrier in the Philippine Sea. The Z-plan itself yellowed in archives, but the human cost of the war it helped shorten was measured in the faces of men like Howard Crisco, who had walked the death march and lived to tell about it, and in the reunion of Gardner and Viola Wynne, who had trusted God and the Filipino people to carry them through the valley. The final image of this story is not a document or a warship. It is a family standing together on a pier in Australia, breathing free air for the first time in 3 years. If any of you have family stories from this era in the Pacific, parents or grandparents who served in the submarines, fought with the guerrillas, or survived the occupation, we would be honored if you shared them in the comments below. We read every one, and if you would like to see more documentaries like this one, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. It helps us keep telling these forgotten stories. Thank you for listening, and thank you for remembering.